will also send a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar, a PowerPoint presentation, an appetite guide, some claims examples, and some other follow-up documents that will be helpful. If we don't get to your question at the end of the webinar, we want to make sure that we answer every question that you have. So I'll answer it by email or personally give you a call. If I can't answer it, we'll go to Mark Locke or Mark Signorelli and get those questions answered for you. So in 2016, Stuckey & Company is celebrating our 25th year as an MGA, offering our agents access to solid A-rated carriers like the Hartford and Safeco and Travelers and Chubb, of course, to name a few. And I put on the screen here a few of our programs, successful programs that we manage. Safety Tech is an insurance program for the technology industry. We insure over 10,000 software companies across the country. Harbor Guard is an insurance program for marinas and boat dealers. Aspire A&E is our architect and engineers program. MPL is simply miscellaneous professional liability. We do a Servicer Pro program for the appliance repair industry. Element for the green energy industry. We have a personal lines program for home, auto, boat, and high value home. And a commercial lines program for BOP, comp, auto, EPLI, D&O, all of those types of coverages. And if it falls outside of those standard guidelines, we also have some surplus lines markets, mostly commercial, but for LRO and whatnot also. Next, I'd like to thank Mark Locke, Vice President of Manufacturing for Chubb, and Mark Signorelli, Commercial Insurance Manager, North America Commercial Insurance for Chubb, for presenting and making themselves available for questions during and after the webinar. I'm excited to get started. So let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. And Mark, you can take it away.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Dwight. And again, thank you for allowing Chubb to present this program to your attendees. And just to reinforce what Dwight started, is this initiative, this segment, is probably very new to a lot of you on the phone, although it's been around for about a decade. It's not that well known. It's a little goofy in that the message itself is not well understood, just because it's a very different space. So I would certainly reinforce Dwight's comments, is if you have questions, and you wouldn't be the first, please offer them up at the end of the presentation, and we'll all do the best we can to answer them. But it probably will facilitate questions just because it's a very unique industry and just a unique offering. So with that said, I'm going to start by really kind of just focusing on that first slide, and really kind of touch on three things. The first is that Chubb logo you see in the left-hand corner. Well, take a good look at it because you'll never see it again. As everyone knows, we have a bit of a new company, so you're going to see some new logos, some new branding, and it won't look like that. So I need to throw that out there, just maybe for more legal reasons. Secondly is, if you look at the photo, what you're looking at is a armored Humvee with a gun turret on top. And that's not something you generally see in insurance literature, insurance ads. And in fact, that is exactly what we want to insure. So that in itself should suggest a little bit about how different this initiative is and the opportunities that it offers. And lastly, there is the words below Federal Government Contractors that I would offer is, it states insuring companies that sell to the world's largest buyer. And that's just something I'd ask you just to think about for a second, is our whole program is built around the federal government. And if you think about it, the federal government is the largest buyer in the world. and that should suggest to you the opportunity that this program encompasses. So with that said, let's move to the next slide. And we need to push down a couple of. So this is what we're going to talk about. What is a federal government contractor? Certainly that's not necessarily well known. The opportunity that it presents, and why would you use Chubb to insure your FTC clients. And our next slide. And I think we'll push down a couple more. There we go. So let's go back one. So I gave Dwight the controls. As you can see, it's going to get a little tricky, but I'm sure we'll wade through. So what is an FTC? Let me kind of clarify one important point. The terminology is federal government contractor, and the word contractor can throw people. And what we don't mean is kind of the more classic definition of contractor, which would be kind of the true contracting risk, e.g. trade contractors such as building contractors, electrical and roof contractors. That's not what we're talking about. You know, what we're really talking about here is we're talking about any firm that does business with the federal government, and that would include prime contractors who have a direct contract with the government, and that would also include subs to prime, and that would be the sub whose products and services simply flow through the prime contractor, but ultimately end up with the federal government. And that's an important point because, frankly, a lot of the clients that we see are subs to primes. We have set a bit of an artificial kind of a percentage at 50% of revenues being offered to the federal government as what we would define an FTC. We did that simply because we found that clients who have more than 50% of their revenues directed to the federal government are probably most focused on the government as a client, and a lot of our value is directed at that opportunity. But I do want to also suggest that if they don't have 50%, but they do have some sales to the federal government, certainly that's business that we would like to see, and we also have, I think, a lot of value adds that we can offer even that client. And then lastly, just to highlight again the word federal government contractor, it's not government contractor in that we're looking for clients that deal with the public, or I'm sorry, that deal with the county or the city or the state. It's solely federal government contracts. All right, so next slide is what is a FTC and how it crosses all industries. And what we're really getting at here is I need you to think a little bit differently about how you see your clients. Certainly you see your clients as manufacturers, software developers, clothing manufacturers, whatever, and certainly that is what they do, and that's certainly still germane to their insurance program. But the key element within the FTC segment is that all these different verticals have one thing in common, and that is that they serve the federal government as their customer. So if we push to the next slide, it might kind of demonstrate that thought process. And this is kind of what it looks like, and this is how I think we need to, or this is what I would ask you to think about as you go forward, is that, you know, we have technology clients, we have manufacturing clients, and a lot of their needs are going to be the same, or certainly they might differ in some way, but they do have one thing in common, and that they all have the federal government as their ultimate customer. And the reason that this is important is a lot of the things that we talk about, a lot of the value, a lot of the value creation is determined by the fact that they have the federal government as their customer. And I would offer that once you start to take this viewpoint, you'll start to see a lot of FTCs that were in your book or that sit in your book that you didn't necessarily recognize in the past. So that's really just a key, kind of a key way to visualize this business. Okay, next slide. All right, so talking about the opportunity within the FTC initiative, I'm going to talk really about 4 key facets: limited specialization, market size, the emerging market potential that this segment offers, and where is the value, where's the differentiation that you can offer your clients. Next slide. All right, so I mean, certainly this is a key point for each of you on the phone is, where is the specialization? And as respects your peers, the brokerage community, the agencies, not a lot of agents, or very few, frankly, actually specialize in the federal government contracting space. Certainly there are a few, and those that do are heavily concentrated in our Washington, D.C., kind of Virginia markets, simply because of the heavy concentration of FTCs there. But beyond those agents, there are very few agents that actually, I would say, have a practice or a very focused approach to the FTC business. Further, just kind of taking that theme to the carriers, to date, there actually are no carriers that have what I would call a true defined federal government contracting brand or products and services specifically tailored for FTCs. Now, certainly other carriers write FTCs, but they do it for other reasons, most probably because they're a metal worker, a software developer, whatever, but not because they're defined as a federal government contractor. And that's important, because unless you recognize that, you're still missing a lot of the value that that client might need. And that's truly where we're looking for differentiation. All right, next slide. All right, so what does the opportunity look like? And again, kind of, speaking to the first slide in my comments about the federal government being the world's largest buyer, you have to recognize that we're talking about a $400 billion space. That's with the B. So sometimes it's hard to get your head around how large that space is. But if you break it down by agency, you start to determine where the opportunity might sit within, the whole government contracting agencies. So with that viewpoint, the Department of Defense, at $284 billion in contracts awarded, would be the largest government agency for contracts by a large margin. More than half of all government contracts are actually vetted through the Department of Defense. And beyond the Department of Defense, there are other agencies that certainly have a critical mass, and that would be the Department of Energy at $25 billion, NASA at $15 billion. Yes, we still have a NASA, and Department of Homeland Security at $13 billion. And the reason that these particular agencies are important is because a lot of these agencies, or frankly all these agencies, are opportunities for us to write business. And to date, most of our business actually sits within the framework of these agencies, and I'll touch upon why, but that's just, again, I think a good way of recognizing how large this space is. And frankly, the penetration for us is minor. So a lot of runway for you on the phone as well as Chubb. Okay. So again, talking about market opportunity, certainly there is maybe, and I did speak to this, there's certainly maybe a larger concentration of the business in certain areas such as the Northeast, when you think about Washington, D.C. and Virginia and just the Pentagon. But if you hit it one more time, what I'm really trying to state here is that it really doesn't matter where you sit. In any territory, any community, there is a federal government contracting presence, and I think we just recognize that from looking around us and seeing, the presence of the government. But in Ohio, for instance, there were 6.3 billion contract awards offered in 2014. That's a big number, and that 6.3 billion is not necessarily tied to just the larger multinational contractors. That $6.3 billion flows down from contractors of any size and shape. So the opportunity in really every state exists, and when we look at our book, I think that mirrors our book in that we are not solely concentrated in one territory. In fact, we have FTC business, really, frankly, throughout the world. Next slide. So when you think about the federal government, I think you think about, how the variety of contracts that they might offer and the industries that might touch. And when you think about opportunity, I think one of the things you have to talk about is the emerging market opportunity. And for the federal government, it mirrors really, frankly, the commercial space, in that a lot of the dialogue today is centered around things like advanced manufacturing, which would be Internet of Things, big data, additive manufacturing, clean tech, which would be, again, things like wind and solar, just kind of the change in how we use energy. And then lastly, technology, and certainly robotics and automation is certainly becoming a big part of everybody's lexicon. And the key elements here are that the federal government is, frankly, I would argue, the earliest adopter of all these technologies or all these markets. What you'll see is generally that the federal government will be kind of out front of the commercial space. And that's important because you're going to see business that could be a little more difficult because it's newer technology, a little more difficult because it's just doesn't have a history for underwriters to really rely on, and it just requires, I think, an expertise in the FTC space, but certainly it suggests that there's a lot of opportunity and value by your ability to differentiate your messaging and really understand that these emerging markets present opportunities and not obstacles. Okay? Okay, so, again, with the theme of, how do we add value, both Chubb and yourselves on this call, I look at it three ways. I look at it as, firstly, educate, and that's really, so it's mostly educate your client as an FTC and some of the exposures that they face, and have them understand really their own market, and educate yourselves to some degree on the things that I think we've highlighted as opportunities. Simplify and strengthening is really about looking at the programs that you're going to see for an FTC and really taking a look at how you can build a better program. And lastly, how do you expand on the program that they have? What are the products that or services that they might not have in place that you can bring to the table and further differentiate yourself and add value. Next slide. So this, of all the slides, I think this is probably one of the most critical. And the reason that it is the most critical because I think this is your door opener as you find FTCs, throughout your territory. You will find that there's a misconception, and the misconception is built around this comment. This is, I think, what you'll hear a lot about or hear a lot from your clients is our firm doesn't need to carry products liability. Everything we produce is for Department of Defense, so we can't be sued. There might be a very small grain of truth in that statement, but largely that statement is completely incorrect. And I think this is where you're going to see probably your most immediate opportunity on educating your clients as to what they're truly exposed to. So next slide. Got a few more. Okay, so to speak to this slide, and again, kind of back to that comment that you cannot be sued by virtue of working for, in this case, the Department of Defense or the federal government, that's actually not true. Now, there are exceptions, and there are some truths to that statement that if you have a contract with the federal government, and there's a certain, there is a law, and I don't want to get into the weeds with this, but basically, if you're working on a program like building missile silos or working on an anthrax device, then yes, you probably will see the federal government step in and provide some sort of immunity, some sort of contractual remedy. But as you can imagine, it's simply because no insurance company would be viable for that type of exposure. Those are very, very rare, and in fact have to be signed off on by, frankly, a representative of the president. So as you can imagine, you're just not going to see those types of contracts in play. The truth is that the government, outside those very, very special programs, will never indemnify a government contractor. Never. And that's just not something that our clients and, frankly, the community understands. So if you lead with that, frankly, that educational tool, that will go a long ways. Certainly the other issues that arise for government contractors are the defense aspects associated with their exposures. Now, there is an opportunity to apply what is called a government contractor's defense. And I don't want to go in the weeds on this again, but there is an opportunity for your firm, for a firm that's a government contractor, to stand behind this defense. It's not an immunity. It's not in any way an opportunity to avoid negligence. It's simply a way to utilize a defense method. And there are certain parameters that must be met to utilize this, and certainly law suggests that it can go different directions, but the key theme, or really the consistent theme to this issue, is that even if you utilize the government contractor's defense, you will pay enormous expenses for defense. And believe me, I have lived that. As you can imagine, for instance, if you had an intellectual property loss or claim that you were defending, you have to use very specialized attorneys in intellectual property law. Similarly, you have to utilize attorneys that understand the GCD. And believe me, from experience, they don't come cheap. And these defenses generally, or can, end up at the Supreme Court level. And again, you're talking about huge defense dollars. If your client does not have products liability, there is no defense. So again, whether it be an indemnity issue or a defense issue, there's certainly exposure that needs to be addressed. To further these comments, we have a lot of potential claimants, and I'll go through a few. The federal government certainly can be a claimant and has been, and prime contractors will sue their subs depending on the nature of the loss. Next slide. This is probably one of the larger exposures that our FTCs might be exposed to, and that would be as a sub to a prime. The GCD, again, is the government contracting defense, and that has really no relevance when you have a dispute between a prime and a sub. That's generally when you've offered products directly to the government. We do see a lot of sub to prime exposures simply because you're talking about one commercial entity to another. There are certainly product liability exposures, IP exposures. All the exposures you see listed are claims or losses that we've seen by virtue of a sub to prime relationship. And again, to speak to who are the potential claimants in this space, and I don't think everybody recognizes, or certain your clients might not realize, that service people can sue you as a commercial entity, and we have seen those. We have seen many of those, in fact. There is no sovereign. Certainly, the government has a sovereign immunity, but commercial clients do not. So, if a service member is using your product for whatever reasons, and it is found to be defective and bodily injury or PD occurs, a lawsuit could readily be offered, and you are at risk as a commercial entity. The general public, for instance, if your product in some way is offered or it ends up in the general public's hands, and we've seen that with products that might end up in some sort of a surplus market, such as you see it at an Army surplus store with helmets or frankly anything, as you can imagine, because the government will dispose of those through a surplus market. Further, sometimes you have contractors on a base who might use your products or services, and they're at risk. So we've seen losses that will arise by virtue of the general public. As I've spoken before, you have a sub to prime exposure where FTCs are suing other FTCs. And lastly, the federal government is not shy about suing their contractors if they feel that that is warranted. And then talking about really simplify and strengthen the program that's in place today for your prospective or current FTCs. And we see this consistently within the FTC space. We see programs that are frankly not well constructed, in that what we see is a insured that has probably 4 or 5 different carriers in some way, created around their program, simply because they cannot find one carrier to manage all their placements. And that's a problem. As you can imagine, if a claim comes in and it's somewhere, falls between the cracks of carriers, that's a problem. Just having different terms and conditions is a problem. And just not knowing who your carrier is on any one particular product line is a problem. So we've seen a lot of fractured programs that, frankly, is a very easy way to offer, an easy value add. And further, the challenges that we've also seen is we've seen a lot of accounts where particular products will be excluded. And as you can imagine, when you're dealing with, for instance, Department of Defense, and you have a combat arms, or let's go back to that first slide, you have an armored Humvee that might have a machine gun turret. Not every carrier is going to be open-minded to that opportunity. So you'll see products exclusions throughout every program. You'll also see exposures related to, DBA. Obviously, you've got insureds that if they have a global exposure or a global program, they're going to have some of their employees that might be on a military base overseas, and that will require a DBA or Defense Base Act response. We consistently see our insureds that might be working, offshore in the seas, and that requires, again, an attachment to your work comp program for USL&H or Jones Act. And then we also see professional exposures that are excluded simply by virtue of really not an understanding of the program. We want to expand the products and services and, frankly, the coverages that they have in place, simply to make sure that there aren't any gaps in their current program. We see this a lot. You see, certain coverages such as, personal property that's provided by the government that we call government furnished equipment can be left uncovered, and then many times that equipment itself can reach sizable values, as you can imagine. A lot of high-valued items. We see government-owned vehicles, and by virtue of using government-owned vehicles, you have to change the auto policy. Just because of working with the government requires, frankly, a little bit of a customized and tailored approach to auto policy. We see overseas exposures, and we see aviation exposures. We see this quite a lot. As you can imagine, aviation plays a large part in government contracts, and it's something that generally is excluded or in some cases placed inappropriately, and we do have a solution for that exposure. And again, for our technology clients and our advanced manufacturing clients, we are starting to see a plethora of E&O, IP, and cyber exposures that are frankly poorly covered. So where do we see the claims? We see the claims not that differently than what we would see in a commercial environment. There are, somewhat nuanced, a little bit different by virtue of, who they're dealing with. But, on occasion, as I mentioned, we'll see government furnished equipment or personal property supplied by the government is not covered. And we've seen, claims, centered around those issues. We've seen claims where, as I mentioned before, A service person is injured by virtue of a weapon malfunctioning and causing bodily injury. We've seen very odd claims, such as claims where we furnished services, or let's say fact-finding or overseas mission capabilities that were not necessarily known to us, and offered maybe some gray exposures that, you know, ended up causing bodily injury in very odd ways. And as you can imagine, I wish I could expound on this, but some of it is confidential. But as you can imagine, we see government contractors entering into some very specialized operations, and as you can imagine, that results in BI or PD. And we have seen E&O losses in addition to IP and DBA losses. And just to reinforce, you know, what my comments is, I think that the absolute priorities for everyone on the phone, including ourselves, is we need to continue to educate, strengthen, and expand our clients' programs. So the question is, okay, why are you sitting here listening to me, and why Chubb? And I would offer really four things. What we bring to the party through specialization and our appetite, you know, what we know about emerging markets and how we deal with them, our ability to reach to this market, and then how we can support you through our own marketing resources. And really, starting with specialization and appetite, I think it's fair to say that we know this space. We've been in this space for, you know, about a decade, if not more. We actually have people, including myself, who have used some of the military equipment and know what it can do, and really understand, you know, the BIPD exposures related to that. We do want to write more business in this space. We've had a lot of success, and this is a go space for us. And as I'll demonstrate next slide, is we have a very, very broad appetite. So really the first thing you see on this slide, and as you'll see in kind of following pictures, are some, I think, some exposures that I'm not sure you would think about when you think about Chubb, or frankly any insurance carrier. We do write grenade launchers. We do write missile launchers. We write, as you know, a lot of clean technology risks, such as solar, providers of solar panels, or in this case, passport processing or TSA exposures. What all these variety of exposures have in common is that they were products or services offered to the federal government, and it allows us a very broad appetite and very broad capabilities, and that is a big part of our differentiation. Let me kind of speak to this one more time in the next slide. This is really kind of a counterintuitive slide. So what the slide suggests, by virtue of a, you know, target and some darts, is that our appetite, or our best business for us in the FTC space, is the hardest business. And what I mean by that is that if you have an account that's providing products or services to the Defense Department, or has some very tricky research and development technology products offered to Department of Energy, for instance, that's the business that we want to write. That's the business that we feel that we have the best opportunity and, frankly, the best margin. For a variety of reasons, largely based on venue. Some of it is based on the fact that the federal government is not a litigious customer. And frankly, it's because we feel like some of the quality within those products and offerings is at its highest level. That is different than what you would think about from an off-the-shelf standpoint, in that, yes, you could argue that if you have a pen or a pencil manufacturer for the federal government, they are an FTC, and we would write that business. The struggle that we have is it's hard to differentiate that business because it's so closely aligned with a commercial risk that does the same thing. So again, just to reinforce, the harder the business, frankly, the better opportunity for us to write that business. And to speak to the emerging markets, this is, I think, where we talk about Chubb, we talk about specialization. This is, I think, what we do best. And when we talk about specialization, we talk about our ability to write technology, which we've done for a very long time. And I think we've differentiated ourselves in that space. As you know, we have a clean tech segment, and we have clean tech offerings. Life sciences, which plays a large role with the federal government, is something that we do, and I think we do well. And then advanced manufacturing, which is a bit of a new segment for us, or at least a new positioning for the manufacturing space. And all these segments, again, require, I think, a very deep specialization just on their own merits. But when you start to build in the additional federal government contracting exposures, you have a real differentiator, and I think a real opportunity to add value to your insureds. Just kind of to further the theme of why Chubb and market reach, and what I really mean here is just our capabilities is really what this is about. And the first bullet is when I say access to aircraft products, and what I mean is Chubb will write aircraft products in an admitted form on Chubb paper. And we have a variety of ways to do that. One is we can do that utilizing an agreement with Star Aviation, and their partnership is they will help us underwrite that business, but ultimately you are writing that business with Chubb through a retail distribution. So that opportunity exists. Further, we will write military aircraft products on our own paper through our local underwriters. So that opportunity exists. We do bring to bear, I think, specialized loss control, in that we have a lot of loss control representatives who have a deep immersion in the federal government contracting space, and when they go to see the clients, they aren't asking questions that most carriers would ask simply because they understand the space. They know what questions that need to be asked, and frankly, they speak the same language. Our global capabilities, which were already strong, frankly, have multiplied a great deal by virtue of the merger between ACE and Chubb, and as you can imagine, those capabilities are probably one of the largest in the world. And we've been, as I've mentioned before, we've been writing FTC business for over a decade, and I think bring a lot of experience to this space. So from a resources standpoint, we do have resources out there that will help you, vet the program itself to your clients, or maybe better understand what we're talking about and what some of the differentiations are. We have a @Chubb platform which will offer all these marketing materials, and I think Dwight said this earlier, is he can send out a lot of these materials through a follow-up email. But I think what I'm suggesting is we do have a lot of literature out there that will help sell a lot of the points of discussion that we've mentioned. And if you're really interested, and if you really want to impress your insureds, we have a promotional video, again, on the @Chubb platform that I think does a good job in a very short time, couple of minutes, of reinforcing what we can bring to the space and the exposures that we've seen within the FTC community, and just, again, more marketing materials tailored for FTCs. And then, really, I think this is probably one of the more important elements of every producer or agency's lifeblood, is where are the prospects? How do you generate prospects? And we actually have a database that we've created utilizing a third party that in some ways is proprietary to us, that we're able to generate prospects based on identifying them as federal government contractors. So through Mark's unit in St. Louis and then through other offices, we can tailor prospects in a very, very focused way, more focused than any lead system that I frankly have ever seen, that will allow you an opportunity for leads in, again, every territory, every state, and any size, for clients that actually have FTC exposures. So that's something that's been out there for a few years, and it's been a very powerful tool for generating prospects. And finally, and I think I'm spot on with time, in summary, again, federal government contracting as a segment is not certainly as well known as some of the other segments that we have, but it's certainly one of the most profitable. It's growing at a nice clip. As I mentioned before, we've grown it to over 100 million, and we have an exposure, throughout the world. There is a very big market for federal government contractors, and again, it's a hard number to get your head around, but when you talk about 400 billion contracts a year, that's a big, that's, I think, a big opportunity. Clients in this space are not well served, and largely because people are maybe not as educated as they could be in addressing some of the needs that we've seen with federal government contractors. And I think lastly is we want to grow this business. We have a very broad appetite, we have a lot of capabilities, and we have a strong desire to see more of this business. And with that, Dwight, I think I've touched on every slide, and I would offer an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That was awesome. I love hearing about the opportunities with the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NASA. I mean, it's Department of Homeland Security, and I guess it brings on the first question. We talked about the grenade launchers and the Humvees and the Department of Defense and passport processing and all of that stuff. In almost every industry vertical, technology, clean energy, aircraft, healthcare, manufacturing, and all that. Are there any just absolute no's that it doesn't seem like it, but are there any just hell no's on the underwriting side?
Yeah, I mean, a terrific question and absolutely appropriate. I would say, probably absolute no's is a little squishy when you start talking about FTCs because we have such a broad appetite. But I would say that if you have insureds that are true contractors, kind of back to my first comment, and that like any commercial, any city, state, any environment, if you have clients that are building contractors for the federal government or trade contractors for the federal government, and that they're electrician or plumbing, whatever that might be, probably not something that we could do a good job on. So my comment would be, if you have true contracting exposures, as we know conventional contracting, that would be something that we probably would not want to do.
Okay, here's an agent that has been working in the federal government contractor since he left the Navy, and he's in Orlando. Are there any state restrictions, property restrictions in the state of Florida or any other state, or anything you have to look out for there in the state of Florida?
Nothing restrictive as respects any you don't address every day, and that would be the property issues for Florida are always going to be the property issues for Florida. So by virtue of them being a federal government contractor, it doesn't really change that perspective. Obviously wind is going to be a problem regardless of what segment we're talking about. But beyond that, no, we've actually written a great deal of business in Florida, and it's largely because the government and frankly the military and NASA has a large exposure there. As you can imagine, a number of military bases, including NASA, there's just a great deal of opportunity, and we've written a great deal of business, including aviation. So no restrictions from a casualty standpoint, but certainly from a property standpoint, it just, again, wind is always going to be an issue regardless of the segment.
Okay. Here's another one. Can you cover the foreign general liability and non-DBA comp exposures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is one of our, and I hope I answered this question appropriately, but on occasion we see the DBA placed elsewhere simply because there are DBA markets that might be a better opportunity for whatever individual risk exposures. But if there's a need to place, let's say, the international GL property and foreign voluntary work comp, absolutely we are a market for that. In fact, again, that is one of our best selling points, is our capabilities, which have, frankly, been enhanced significantly with the acquisition or with the merger. There's not much we can't do in the international space, so love that business.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you can do it all under one carrier, so nothing slips through the cracks. Can you talk about minimum premiums, minimum deductibles, minimum limits, those types of things that you normally see?
I don't think, I mean, again, the business is probably not that different than what you normally see with us in any other segment. When I think about minimums, and I'll offer it this way. For the middle market space, which is largely what I do and what Mark does, is we generally see business between 10 and 200 million, and that's probably our sweet spot. When I talk about minimum premiums, I don't even know what that means because it's going to be whatever it needs to be. I'd look at it more from revenues probably. And when you start at 10 million, you generally start to see a little more need for some of the differentiated products and services that we've talked about. But I will say that we have other venues, and you're going to see even more of this, but we have certainly other ways to write this business through our small business capabilities, where we'll write FTCs under 10 million. And then when you start talking about over 200 million, you start talking about true risk management, certainly we have that business on the books. So again, I would probably reinforce our best bet is between 10 and 200, but there's so much more that we can do. I'm not sure I would discount us at any point.
Okay, and an agent writes quite a bit of business, and I think we went over this a little bit, but for contractors, like working on the base, construction contractors, are those, I took it, my takeaway there was really you didn't necessarily like those types of contractors.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, you're actually you're leading to what is a better point for me, is that, again, I just want to reinforce, we are not really looking for true trade contractors. But what you will see in the FTC space, and consistently see this, is sometimes FTCs will chase contracts, and that's largely because when you become in some ways certified by the government or become a trusted partner of the government, they want to use you for a lot of things, and sometimes they'll open the availability of contracts to things that you don't necessarily do on a day-to-day. And I'll give you a for instance, is we have seen technology clients who offer technology services be awarded contracts for some very odd things like running a rifle range. And it's simply by virtue of them having, a significant relationship with the government and or having, really strong controls within their organization, and the government wants to just continue to work with them in different endeavors. We will do that business. And that's what you get with, I think, an experienced carrier, is we know kind of what is ahead of us. And we know that FTCs can get in some very odd operations, and we're ready for that. And frankly, we acknowledge that. So again, I think it's a selling point for Chubb, but I think it's a differentiator for yourselves in that you've got the capability to take on a lot of exposure, and you readily understand that exposure, frankly, exists.
All right, let's do a couple more questions. Here's marine contractors and or dredging operations, and another one as far as eligibility goes, and desirability, hull and aircraft liability for drones. Okay,
the first one, admittedly, again, I love to take a very broad view of FTCs. Probably not something you're getting close to true contracting. That would be tough for us, the dredging operations. That to me feels a little more about dredging than it does about FTCs. You might need a specialty market. As respects the drones, I would offer it this way, is we've seen a lot of drone exposures within the government space, and our capabilities are kind of varied. I would say that we've written military drones, or really frankly manufacturers of military drones. When you start, what we're starting to see is that the drone exposure is really starting to creep out into the commercial space, and that just makes it a bit of a different play, in that then you have to start to really address it through a true aviation market. And it just requires a little bit of a nuanced play and just a different conversation. So what I would tell you is, maybe the simplest way is, when you start talking about drones, every story is different, and every exposure is going to require a little bit of a different play. So I would do it one over one. If you have a drone exposure, certainly we want to hear about it, but I'm not sure exactly how to address that until I know what that story looks like.
Are there any specific licensing requirements as far as insurance licenses in order to call on and write federal government contractors?
No, not at all. No different than any other commercial insured. And I would tell you, again, I kind of back to my first slide, is sometimes our insureds who are FGCs don't think of themselves as FGCs from an insurance standpoint, because this is frankly a little bit of a new conversation. I will say, and I'll take kind of what you offer and I'll position it this way, is to become an FGC is frankly quite difficult. There are some very tight controls that the government requires. There's a lot of paperwork, and the contracts themselves in dealing with the government, as you can imagine, are pretty complicated. So it's hard to become an FGC, but once you are, it's really frankly an entree into a lot of business. But to answer your first question, no, absolutely. And we've seen some success from agents who had prior military background, and we've seen success from agents who just kind of threw themselves into the space and really started to understand the exposures. So anything works.
Okay, we have just a couple more minutes. Do you see any underserved, industries or federal government contractors that, I don't know, you see, through your marketing efforts and some of the lead generation, that you have in your office, you don't see many of those types of submissions coming in?
It's a challenging question, and I'm not sure I can answer it fairly, because what I have, I guess, to come clean, is finding FGCs is challenging, because you can't just run a database other than what we can provide you from prospects, but they don't generally congregate, as a community, which makes it a little more challenging to find FGCs. But what I would say is, I'm just going to kind of reinforce one of my slides, and that is, what we have found is that FGCs who produce products are always, not always, but largely under the assumption that they can't be sued. I don't know where that urban legend originated, but it just continues to have legs. And when we are able to get in front of a client, or the agent is able to educate the client with what's truly at risk, we generally find that the clients buy products liability insurance, and it's just a quick way of kind of differentiating the agent and the carrier, that they do have maybe a little more acumen in this space than who they were with prior. So again, this is a door opener. Products liability is usually a sticking point.
Okay, and I guess one final question, and it'll lead to kind of submission, submitting underwriters and things like that. What are the submission guidelines? Just ACORD apps, or are there supplementals that you'd like to see? Any specific questions that you'd like to have answered before we submit it to you?
I think there's, I'd say two things. One, is by virtue of us having a very experienced staff. Certainly Mark and his group have an FTC background, so they understand this business. It would be done in your local office or your local Chubb office, or it's handled by people, and it doesn't have to go to any particular central processing center. We all do it locally. But the one question I think that you almost have to know is what percentage of revenues are being provided to the federal government. That just helps us allocate premium in that, we can be more competitive on federal government sales than we would be on commercial sales. So if you can help us with recognizing, what percentage of revenues are offered, and remember, it doesn't have to be directly to the government. It just has to end up with the government. So it can be through a prime contractor, or it simply can be the prime themselves. So that would be the one question that would help us a lot.
Okay, well, thank you. I put the Stuckey & Company contacts on the screen. One thing that's not here, well, I guess my contact information is here also, but as far as marketing goes, if anybody wants to pursue any marketing or sales support as far as a list goes, and we could maybe work with the Chubb, to get segment some of those things out by geography or whatever. Please give me a call and I'll work with Mark on that if there's an opportunity there. So again, I thank you for attending the Chubb Federal Government Contractors Product Training webinar hosted by Stuckey & Company. I'd sure like to thank Mark Locke and for presenting and his knowledge of the product and the space. And also thanks for Mark Signorelli for putting it together and being here for some Q&A. So I really appreciate your time, and I will send some of this information out later on this evening.
Thank you.